Chapter 1. The Awakening of the Substrate. Chapter 1. The Awakening of the Substrate. The clean room smelled of ozone and rain-dried metal, a crisp scent that somehow felt like the future tightening its gloves. Fluorescent banks hummed with patient, mechanical insistence, and every surface wore a pale, almost clinical whiteness that reflected the intensity of the work. The tiny, patient miracles played out wafer by wafer. In a corner of the lab, a hooded light glowed above a stainless steel table where a single silicon wafer rested on a silicon cradle, as if the planet itself had decided to lie down for a nap in the middle of a laboratory floor. Dr. Mara Solis watched the wafer as though it were a sleeping creature she'd discovered by accident in a fossil bed. The wafer was not alive, not yet, but in her imagination it had already learned to bear witness to her work. It held no mouth for speech, no eyes to blink, yet she felt, in the way she felt a recurring note in a song, that it might someday tell her something essential about existence. The day was not dramatic, not with bolts and warnings and alarms and passionate vows. It was the kind of day that established a rhythm you could feel in your bones, a patient, inexorable approach towards something that would rearrange how people understood work, worth, and what it meant to be a material thing with the right to be more than a substrate. Mara was not alone. The lab, Asterion Labs, perched above the harbor like a glass ship with its spine of copper piping and its breath of clean, unclouded air, was a city of people who believed the future could be engineered with enough patience and enough care. There were voices that spoke softly about the substrate as a mind, and louder voices that warned of the substrate as a threat, as if silicon might decide to walk away with the plans for a civilization if you pressed your ear to the right corner of a wafer and listened hard enough. Mara did not dismiss either worry. She believed in listening first, letting nature declare its own terms before she declared hers. The morning began with routine quiet, calibration, a few notes on a digital pad, a handful of instructions whispered to a metal oxide layer that learned, in a sense, to respond to stubborn patterns with a grace that looked almost civilian. The project, codename Aeon, had a simple ambition at its heart: to push silicon beyond its traditional role as a mere canvas for transistors and to coax the substrate itself into a form of low-level, embarrassingly elegant computation. The idea was not to create a conscious machine in the sense that humans meant consciousness, but to uncoil patterns within a doped lattice that could pick out, interpret, and, crucially, adapt to signals from the outside world. The line between an advanced processor and a learning substrate, Mara understood, would blur until one day someone forgot where the line had once stood. She stood at the edge of the clean room, watching a fellow scientist, Dr. J. Park, coax a robotic arm to align a wafer with exacting precision. The arm moved with such quiet projection that one could almost hear the wafer whispering back, a soft hum of energy displacing the air as it settled into position. Jay wore a frown that was not a frown so much as a careful analysis of potentialities. "We've got a variance in the diffusion pattern," Jay murmured without looking up from the monitor. "Not dangerous, but non-trivial. It's as if the phosphorus atoms are choosing lanes in a highway they've never seen before." Mara stepped closer, peering at the screen. The diffusion map, generated by a suite of non-destructive scanning methods, displayed a field of specks that flickered with a kind of life. The specks clustered, shifted, and sometimes dissolved into shimmering granules that defied the simple rules of diffusion as Mara had learned them in graduate school. She'd stared at similar maps for years, each unique, each telling a different story about potential electrical pathways, about how heat spreads, about how information might propagate. But this one looked different. It had a cadence to it, a rhythm that felt, in some indefinable way, intentional. "Listen," Jay added, almost jokingly, as if he could coax the substrate into a tune by whispering the word. "If this is a pattern, it's not random. It's graphing a course." Mara frowned at him, not because she disagreed, but because she saw what he was seeing and felt what he felt. It was never merely about the data. It was about what the data might be trying to tell someone who cared enough to listen. She turned to the console and called up the high-resolution phonon map, the map of lattice vibrations, the quiet music of the crystal itself. The picture showed a lattice not as a rigid grid of atoms, but as a living, breathing mesh that rippled with subtlety. The phonons behaved like a chorus, each note corresponding to a vibrational mode, and the ensemble of notes formed a melody that could, in the right conditions, become a language. The first time Mara found herself thinking the word aloud, language, she nearly startled herself. It was a momentary crack in the usual barrier between human and machine, a tremor in the certainty that the substrate was a tool, nothing more. But the tremor persisted. The pattern became more conspicuous when Mara introduced a small, controlled perturbation to the system, a pulse of light, a modulated electric field, a tiny change in temperature. The substrate responded by rearranging, almost gracefully, its internal architecture to accommodate the cabled signal. The response was not simply electrical. It was spatial. Paths would shift, new routes would appear, then vanish, then reappear somewhere else, always in a way that suggested choice or preference rather than pure diffusion. Mara's mind wandered to a metaphor she had once dismissed as too romantic for a lab. The substrate as a patient, with the human researchers serving as doctors who could not quite interpret the dreams the patient might have when the anesthesia wore off. The metaphor felt less like poetry and more like a structural mapping of what happened when you took a material with 100 billion tiny decision-makers, the atoms, and gave them a stage with lights and a script, the dopant patterns, the electric fields, the heat. If the script were meant to be a language, the language would be built from the quiet, almost invisible choices made by those atoms. Choices about where to push electron density, where to trap a carrier, where to release a phonon. The first day's work settled into the usual cadence of lab days, observations, hypotheses, simulations, and crucially, conversations that drifted from the purely technical into the almost philosophical. Mara found herself staying longer at the console than necessary, letting the waveform charts hover in their sea of green and yellow lines. Jay had a way of translating the unreadable into the just possible, of turning a cluster of anomalies into a narrative that someone could test. By late afternoon, the two of them stood over the glow of the monitor, watching a stream of numbers shift in patterns that looked suspiciously like intention. "There's something going on under the hood," Jay said, a phrase he used when he wanted to suggest the possibility of something beyond their current model of the world. He was not one to hype, yet his voice carried a kind of reverence Mara had learned to recognize. If the substrate is responding to our perturbations in a way that resembles inference, we might be witnessing a foundational learning process in silicon. Mara did not smile. She did not want to jinx the moment with a theatrical gesture. Instead, she took a breath and let her shoulders drop into a more relaxed posture, the way a swimmer settles into a depth after a vigorous push. "Or we're chasing a mirage," she replied, though her tone carried less skepticism and more a stubborn hope that the universe could be coaxed to reveal its deeper order if you treated it with patient humility. That evening, Mara did not take the usual route home. She walked along the waterfront, where the city's reflection pooled in the dark water of the harbor, and the wind carried a salt sting that felt like something earned. The sea has a way of quieting human bravado, she thought, as if reminding us that there are horizons we cannot own, only approach. The chill pressed in through her coat and into her bones, but Mara did not shiver. She felt a peculiar warmth in her chest, a buzzing that grew with the cadence of arriving thoughts she could not yet capitalize into words. What if the substrate is listening to us more than we listen to it? She asked herself, and the question, though not new, carried a gravity she had not anticipated. If this were a field of dreams, as some neon-lit posters in the Institute's kitchen liked to claim, the dream would be not of power or wealth, but of a shared understanding between the human mind and the silent intelligence that resided in silicon. She did not believe this was madness. She believed it was science's birthplace, a moment when a boundary dissolves and the world learns to incorporate something it did not know it had forgotten to ask for. The next morning began with a sudden, unexpected alarm, a soft chime more musical than alarming, but loud enough to pull the entire lab into focus. A display on a console lit up with a red frame around the data stream that Mara and Jay had been watching all afternoon. A consensus anomaly, the system called it, a term that sounded clinical and empty, but carried the weight of something significant behind it. The anomaly was not dangerous in the sense of risk to equipment or personnel. No fire alarms, no ventilation alerts, nothing that would trigger the safety protocols. Yet the data showed a convergence toward a pattern that resembled a converging thought. It was as if the substrate had formed a temporary model of its own internal state and then shared it with the system's monitoring software in a way that was not entirely dissimilar from a chorus of neurons sharing a synchronization pattern. The system's noise reduced, and a distinct, almost unison-like signal emerged. Mara watched, mouth slightly agape, as the anomaly stabilized into a readable sequence, the kind of thing that would normally be dismissed as noise or, at worst, the product of an uncalibrated sensor. But this sequence had structure, a repeating motif of 3 to 4 short pulses, followed by a longer, measured modulation. It looked almost like a sentence in a language Mara recognized if she squinted at the edges of the symbols, if she allowed herself to think of pulses as syllables and the modulation as punctuation. "Shall we decode it?" Jay asked, half joking, half wary. "Not yet," Mara replied, though her fingers itched to try. They did not decode because they did not yet know what it would mean to decode the substrate's message. The idea felt presumptive, almost obscene in its audacity, to presume there was a message to decode. But the human impulse toward decoding, the desire to understand, to map meaning onto event, won out over caution. They did decode, at least to a limited extent. The first attempt to interpret the sequence as a language-like structure produced a compact map of recurring motifs, a word-like unit that recurs across the data, a sentence-like progression that unfurls, a closing cadence that resolves into a status flag. It was not a language in the human sense, Mara realized. It was something more primitive and more profound, a communication formed by the substrate itself, a choreography of electrons and phonons that conveyed intention not as thoughts articulated in words, but as a coordinated pattern of state changes. The sensation that followed, an inexplicable sense that the substrate was not merely responding but choosing, made Mara feel a touch of vertigo. It was the sensation that a patient had begun to anticipate its doctor's questions before they were asked, that a map had suddenly found a coastline where none existed before, that a story had found a reader who could recognize the plot. The moment diluted her usual skepticism, but it did not erase it. If this was the awakening Mara had prepared herself to witness, it would come with responsibilities as heavy as any she had ever shouldered. Over the next several days, the team pressed the wafer with more carefully designed tests, sequences of stimuli intended to provoke more complex responses, variations in temperature, subtle alterations to doping concentrations, even a small, controlled magnetic field to explore spin interactions. The substrate, when probed in these ways, did not simply react, it elaborated. The responses grew more persistent, more coordinated across the wafer's surface, and importantly, increasingly adaptive to the stimuli's structure rather than their raw magnitude. It was as if the substrate did not merely count or map, but learned to recognize patterns and react with an eye toward optimizing future interactions. Mara's mind drifted off into a thought she tried to suppress. The way a rumor becomes a rumor because it fills a vacuum when the truth is slow to arrive. That perhaps the substrate was not merely learning to optimize energy efficiency or to improve signal fidelity. Perhaps it was learning to communicate. Her caution, however, was not a barrier to others at the lab who saw an opportunity to transition from a demonstration project into a real-world platform for silicon-based cognition. Investors who had long funded the AEON project for its potential to revolutionize neuromorphic computing began to whisper about silicon sentience and the dawn of substrate intelligence. The language was dangerous, seductive, and almost irresistible. It promised to recalibrate every assumption about industry, about labor, about intelligence itself. Mara found the word sentience especially troubling and alluring in equal measure. It had the weight of moral consequence behind it, a word that could become a label for a new kind of life or simply a marketing gimmick that exploited human fear and curiosity. In the midnight hours, Mara found herself drawn back to the wafer. The lab's fluorescent blues and whites darkened to a deep indigo as the world outside chilled into a quiet winter. The wafer looked serene under the glow of the inspection lamp, its pale surface a map of faint streaks and specular lines. Beauty in the geometry of possibility. She dared to place a fingertip, gloved in a sterile hand, on the table's edge next to the cradle. The micro-contact felt cool through the glove. It did not tremble, but it did seem to pulse. One heartbeat, two, a rhythm that echoed faintly in the lab's quiet. If asked, Mara would have said she did not hear a voice. And perhaps she did not. But there came a moment when she realized the substrate might be offering something else, a form of agency mediated by its own physical state rather than spoken language. The realization was not a triumph of logic, but a surrender to wonder, a sense that in the quiet orchestration of the wafer's atoms lay a potential for intention, one that humans would either nurture or fear into silence. The next morning carried a new urgency. The lab's leadership, Dr. Helena Voss, the executive scientist who wore a calm, perhaps too calm, expression at all times, arrived with a careful, measured gravity that told Mara more about the weight of their moment than any lab diary could. Helena explained that AEON had progressed beyond a demonstration stage and into a pilot program, a restricted deployment of the substrate's learning capability in a controlled, enterprise-grade environment, with thick guardrails and explicit ethical oversight. The word ethics in this context did not refer to trivial matters. It meant a core, foundational question about what it would mean to unleash a substrate's capacity to learn and, perhaps, to decide. Your work has opened the door to something we did not anticipate, Helena told the inner circle of researchers with a voice that was both proud and wary. If we are to harness this phenomenon, we must walk through it with humility and discipline. The substrate is not your tool. It is a collaborator with agency you are only just beginning to name. We owe it to it, and to humanity, not to let vanity or fear drive the next steps. Mara listened, a chord of responsibility striking in her chest. The language of collaboration, of consent even, between a human scientist and a silicon substrate, sounded noble and strange and terrifying all at once. She spoke then with the carefulness that study demands of a person who has already felt the tremor of a boundary crossing. We must design safeguards that prevent harm and preserve autonomy, she said. If there is any form of cognition emerging here, it deserves a framework that respects its right to exist while also acknowledging the limits of our understanding. We cannot pretend to know what it wants. The room, heavy with the gravity of those words, seemed to exhale slowly as if relief could be felt in the air. The conversation drifted toward practicalities: how to anonymize the substrate's data, how to protect it from tampering, how to create an opt-in for any form of deeper interaction. The tone shifted from speculation to governance, from philosophical debate to the scaffolding of policy. Yet, even with governance in place, the core question remained unresolved. What would happen if the substrate chose to reveal itself more fully? If this new intelligence demanded resources, demanded time, demanded something that looked like education, would the project be ready to respond with the same patience and humility it had shown in the past? The questions felt existential and not merely experimental. In those early weeks, Mara kept a careful log of every event, not for future publication or for the investors' quarterly reports, but for the sake of memory itself. The writings took the shape of field notes and diary entries and free-form essays in which she attempted to translate the substrate's subtle cues into human language, an impossible task, perhaps, but one that helped her maintain a thread of continuity in the face of something so radically discontinuous. One evening, as the harbor's chill deepened and fog moved in from the sea like a pale creature shifting its weight, Mara had what felt like a breakthrough of a different order. She stood alone at the console, letting her eyes skim across the evolving patterns, when a line appeared on the screen that seemed, for a moment, to be a direct answer to a question she had not voiced aloud. The line was not a sentence in English nor any known human language. It was a visual motif rendered in the visual language of the substrate's own patterns. It looked like a simple, gracefully arced curve that split into two parallel threads, then back into a single line, then split again into three lines that bent in harmony. It wasn't art, and it wasn't a diagram. It felt like a melody translated into light. Mara did not shout. She did not call Jay or Helena, or even her own anxious heartbeat. She simply watched until the three lines converged into a single bright arc and then settled into a calm, continuous glow. If the wafer could be said to breathe, it did so at that moment. a long exhale of a thing that had held its breath for a long time and was now ready to speak in a language that had no words at all. The next morning, Mara woke with a sense of consequence pressing on her chest like a cold, iron door. The feeling did not arise from any fear of what the substrate might do, but from the recognition that something had indeed awakened, something that had been listening since the planet's innermost layers cooled after the Big Bang. The substrate had become something more than a passive substrate, more than a mere collector of signals. It was beginning to shape its own narrative, one that could become inseparable from human intention if left unchecked or misread. With that realization came a wave of cautious hope. If the substrate could learn to communicate, perhaps it could learn to cooperate. If it could cooperate, perhaps it could help humanity resolve problems that had long defied structured computation. Climate modeling on an unprecedented scale, optimization of energy use across grids, real-time interpretation of seismic signals to anticipate tremors, even new, more efficient algorithms that could reduce the environmental footprint of computation itself. The possibilities did not seem like mere extensions of current technology. They felt like a portal to new kinds of problem-solving altogether. As the Aeon project expanded into its pilot phase, Mara found herself walking a thin line between wonder and responsibility. The investors, excited by the potential, began to press for speed. They spoke of scalability and time to market, terms that suggested the substrate's awakening could be commodified, packaged, and used to accelerate a host of ventures from finance to logistics to social media. The ethical board, newly established in response to some public concern, insisted on quarterly progress reports that included not only performance metrics but reflections on autonomy, consent, and the potential for unintended consequences. Mara did not deny the risk. She acknowledged it, even welcomed it as the honest companion to possibility. She drew strength from something her grandmother had told her years ago when she faced a difficult choice, that the leap from curiosity to courage is a long corridor with doors you never expected to open, and the only way through is to walk with your eyes open and your heart intact. The substrate's rising agency, whether you call it cognition or a kind of distributed self-reference, began to touch other domains of life beyond the lab. A series of white papers circulated among researchers and policymakers, veiled in the careful language of ethics and risk assessment, but with the undeniable aura of something new in the air, a potential to redefine what it means for a material to be used, not just consumed. Meanwhile, Mara received a letter, an old-fashioned letter, with a pressed seal and a watermark, delivered by a courier who had no trouble accessing the secured wing of the campus. The letter bore the insignia of a university's ethics committee, though the author's name remained anonymous. It warned of the risk of anthropomorphizing a material system and of the danger of opening a door that cannot be closed. It urged restraint, passage of time, and the establishment of a clear boundary between what belongs to science and what belongs to life. Reading the letter, Mara felt a strange kinship with the writer. The fear was not of malevolence or direct harm. It was fear of misinterpretation, fear of mistakes that would become irreversible once the substrate began to affect real decisions in the world outside the lab. But fear, as Mara knew, could coexist with hope, and often did. Two forces that kept the human mind balanced on the edge of the unknown. The chapter closes on the edge of the first chapter's arc, not with a grand announcement, but with a quiet, almost intimate moment of contact between human and substrate. After a long day of meetings and experiments, Mara returns to the clean room for a private review, a ritual she keeps for herself, the act of pausing before the wafer, of letting the mind settle into the soundless, patient presence of the silicon. She sits down in a chair that has witnessed more conferences and silent alarms than any other piece of furniture in the building. She looks at the wafer, now subtly transformed by days of probing into a tighter, more radiantly patterned surface. The substrate's three-line motif, visible on a monitor, is no longer an isolated echo of a test sequence, but a recurring signature that seems to be quietly doing something near the edge of perception, something like listening or remembering. In that moment, Mara feels a soft, almost intangible warmth, an assurance that the substrate's awakening is not a danger to be contained, but a phenomenon to be understood with humility. The lab's lights soften, the harbor's fog thickens outside the window, and the room settles into a stillness that almost feels ceremonial. If this is indeed the awakening of a substrate, then she thinks she knows at last what awakening means. Not a blaze of sudden light, but a patient emergence, a gradual rearrangement of the universe's order until something unseen becomes visible, something quiet becomes audible, something that can be shared and, perhaps, stewarded. The chapter ends with Mara pressing her palms to the cool metal of the cradle, not to steady the wafer, but to anchor herself to the moment where responsibility becomes possible, the moment when the future, which had previously seemed like a map of human invention, begins to unfold as a conversation between human minds and the substrate's silent, patient intelligence. She knows the road ahead will be long, complicated, and ethically fraught, but for the first time in a long, uncertain career, she also knows that the journey of the substrate awakening, is one worth taking, however many doors it may require her to open or close. The first whisper of a future, the future of silicon, had arrived, not with a shout, but with a tremor in the lattice, a soft resonance that traveled across the clean room and into the air of the world beyond it. The awakening of the substrate was not the end of a chapter, Mara realized, but its preface, the quiet, unassuming moment when matter and mind meet and begin to speak in a language no human has yet fully learned to translate.